Welcome to everyone tuning in to this particular Bible study. Though we cannot meet together in person, we can continue our study of God's Word. We were about to begin our Sunday adult class looking at the post-exilic prophets. We're going to continue that study or take up that study in this format until we can return to meeting together once again. We begin our study of these post-exilic prophets, those being Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, understanding that these were men chosen by God to deliver a specific message to the Jewish nation following their return from the exile in Babylon. We're going to take a look at some historical context that will be helpful throughout our study of these three prophets, as well as some other relevant Old Testament scripture that also lends some information that's relevant to these three prophets as well. Our modern concept of a prophet likely leans to that idea of someone who foretells the future. But most often in the Old Testament, a prophet is someone who is called by God to deliver a message to the people at a time that it's needed. While the books of Zechariah and Malachi do both include prophecy itself, we refer to them as prophets or consider them prophets primarily because they were chosen to deliver a message to God's people in the time of the Old Testament. The nation of Israel that we see described throughout the Old Testament, ranging from the time of the Exodus or leaving of Egypt and the captivity that they were under there, through the close of the book of Malachi, characterizes a people who ran hot and cold, as we would say today. They would go through stretches of time where they would be very faithful servants, actually, to God. They would worship only Him. They would follow the statutes that were set down for them in the law of Moses. But with time, they tended to stray away. They would become less faithful in their service. They would become influenced by those around them who worshiped other gods and had other practices. Things like intermarrying would cause them to become open to the ideas of the religions that existed around them, all in contradiction to what God had told them to do. This idea of people who have a set of rules and do it well at times and not do it so well at other times, we can see that in the parent and child relationship in our own lives. Parents set rules or set expectations for their children. Children need to be taught those expectations in a way that they can understand it, but then they're expected to live by them. At times they do very well. Their effort is truly there to please their parents and live in the manner that they have taught them or asked them to do. Other times they're influenced by their friends and those around them who maybe don't have those same expectations or standards in their home, and they can be led to engage in behaviors that are really not consistent with what their parents consider acceptable. When those times occur, good parents discipline their children, not as a source of punishment, but as a source of teaching. And we're going to see that in the Jewish people throughout this period. When they would stray away, God would discipline them. This would be in ways such as using other nations to overpower them for a period of time, perhaps put them in some form of oppression, whether it be military occupation or affecting their commerce adversely. This would tend to go on for some period of time until the people finally would realize that their situation was because the relationship was not right with God. And they would call out for forgiveness and for restoration to Him. For many centuries, this situation was remedied by God through raising up judges. They would lead the people toward restoration. Some of those judges were more of a military sense. They would gather the people together to rise up against the occupying nation, the nation that was threatening them. thereby setting themselves free and being able to worship and conduct themselves in a manner that was consistent with God's will again. At other times, it was more of a spiritual restoration, not an outside force affecting them, but their own failure to follow God's commands. And someone would be raised up who would lead the people back to a restoration of their faith and proper behavior, that they could be restored in a right relationship with God. Eventually, the people of Israel called to have a king of their own. This was truly a failure on their part to recognize that God was their true king, that he was better than any man could be as a king for them, but yet this is what they saw in the nations around them, and they felt that that was something that they should have as well. The first king who was chosen at God's direction was Saul, son of Kish. He was eventually followed by David and Solomon, the son of David. Israel enjoyed probably its greatest height as a world power during the reign of Solomon, who was recognized to be one of the wisest men, was sought after by leaders of other nations for advice and counsel. The nation of Israel was paid tribute by nations around them because of their recognition of how powerful Israel was. And that was all because of their relationship with God, not because of their own personal might. However, following Solomon's reign, or upon his death, the nation of Israel became fractured. There was dissension within his own family as to who would lead, turmoil there. The eventual leader did create division even between the nation of Israel in placing greater and greater demands upon them, and basically not showing the wisdom that Solomon had shown, obviously, in his reign. This causes a split of the nation into two. The northern kingdom retains the name Israel, and the southern kingdom becomes known as Judah. Judah consists of Jerusalem, the location of the temple, and is made up of the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, who remains with them. This fracture makes Israel, in general, much more susceptible to the nations around them. They are no longer the great power. Now those around them are of greater power and are a threat to the nation of Israel itself. The northern kingdom, known as Israel, was overcome beginning in 732 BC, or 740 BC, depending on whose dating method you prefer. Over a course of approximately 10 years, the Assyrian nation, who overtook Israel, carried away the vast majority of the people of Israel, settling them in other lands. This was a common practice of conquerors of the time. They wanted to remove the people from their old lands and place them somewhere else. They felt that it made them more accepting of their command, that they would not feel so close and so personal to the place where they were living, and would be less likely to revolt. Judah itself lasted another 80 years or so, standing, but was eventually conquered by the Babylonians. This was under the command of King Nebuchadnezzar. Babylonia actually took control around 605 BC, but did not immediately begin deporting everyone. At first, they chose what they considered the choice captives, people of noble birth, people who seemed to have special skills or abilities. This would include Daniel. He was among the first captives taken from Judah by the Babylonians. The bulk of the remaining people were relocated by the Babylonians over a 10-year span. that began around 597 BC and was completed around 586 BC. At this time, there had been an insurrection, an attempt by Judah to rebel against Babylon. There was harsh judgment rendered against Judah as a result. The Babylonian king was very perturbed at this insurrection, this uprising. So there was great suffering within Judah at the end. And at the end of the period, or at the end of this time, when the conquest is again completed, the temple, which was originally built by Solomon, according to the plan that David was given, was completely destroyed. It was torn to the ground, and anything left was burned. This left no remnant then of that temple, that connection that the people had to God. And again, they were captured away, or taken away into captivity in Babylon, so that they would not be left in their homeland where they would feel some special connection to it and would be more subservient to the Babylonians. So I hope this slide gives us kind of a timeline, or a way to put all of this in perspective for this conqueror, for this exile, and how it transpires and eventually will lead to the return. In 539 BC, while Judah was in captivity in Babylon, Persia overthrows Babylon. Persia was led by the king Cyrus in 539 BC. The following year, 538 BC, we read that Cyrus is moved by God to allow the Jews to return to Judah. He decrees that any Jewish captive who was taken in the Babylonian capture of Judah, who wants to return to Jerusalem, may do so, with the understanding that their purpose is to go back, to re-inhabit the land, and to rebuild the temple. These were all things put into Cyrus's heart by God, by his plan. There is a very positive response to this offer. There are nearly 50,000 people who return. Among those are 42,360 who can trace their ancestry from Judah itself while and were in captivity. And they took with them another 7,337 servants that had become connected to them in one way or another while they were in that captivity in Babylon. They begin their return in toward the end of 538 or early 537 BC. It takes several months for them to make the trip. They're led by two people that we will encounter as we begin our studies. Zerubbabel is an administrator. He is essentially the person designated to be the governor or administrator in the stead or with the permission of King Cyrus. The other person is Joshua. Joshua could be traced to the priestly line from Aaron, and he was to return as the high priest, understanding that they would need a priest to lead in terms of their worship to God and their service to God. So these were all things that Cyrus not only approved of, but encouraged them to do. After they had returned and been there for approximately a year and a half, they had enough time for the people to basically build themselves shelters or rebuild some homes to the extent that they could begin the work on the temple itself. They had places to live and could begin then this work. And in 536 BC, they took up the work of laying the stones that would be the foundation of the temple. As they began this work, those around them, those who lived in the lands around them, were really jealous of them returning. They were concerned. They did not understand exactly why they were there, what their purpose was. They only saw them as a threat to their standing. So they worked diligently to try to make it difficult for the Jewish people to succeed at rebuilding the temple at every opportunity they could. And eventually it ended up writing to the new king, he who had replaced Cyrus, suggesting to him that the work that was going on in Jerusalem was not a good thing, that he should look at the records of the past and he would see what a unreliable group of people these Jewish people were, and it was probably just not in his best interest to let them continue this. When the letter arrived to the king, he had his scholars look up the records of the Jewish people, and finding that that was quoted in the letter was actually correct from their standpoint, ordered that the work on the temple be halted. And that letter was sent and executed among the Jewish people in 534 BC. So they got to work for approximately 2 years on the temple before work was stopped. The Jewish people went back to essentially worrying about their own needs. They worked on their houses, improved them, made them better. They did their best to plant crops, to work on vineyards and trees that would produce, as well as the needs of everyday life. And that's really where their attention focused to. They really did not put as much thought anymore into the work that they had really been sent to accomplish, which was to rebuild the temple. And it laid without making any progress for a very long time. In 520 BC, Haggai is called by God to deliver a message to the people that they need to resume the work of building the temple. Their lot in life has not been great up to this point. They've not been terribly successful at things like their crops and their animals. It's not gone well. And Haggai is going to explain to them the reason for that, and it has to do with their failure to fulfill this job that God had given them. He will soon be joined by Zechariah, actually within that year. Haggai is going to be a spokesman for God for a relatively short period of time, less than a year. Zechariah's period will last approximately 5 or 6 years, again, depending on the dating method that you go by. We're going to find that they were pretty successful in their message. They spurred the people back to the work. Those around tried to intercede again. New King Darius looked things up and said, nope, this is what was decreed to be done, and told the people around them to quit interfering, or they'd have to answer to the Persian Empire for it. They completed the new temple in 516 BC. The next thing we see within history, so there's a period of relative good, relative calm. Things are going well for the nation. In 458 BC, Ezra will lead a large second contingent of returnees from Babylon back to Judah and Jerusalem. A few years later, we encounter the events that are recorded in Nehemiah, where he returns. He has heard in Babylon of how the city walls have not been rebuilt, and there's a lack of safety. That troubles him, and he gets the king's permission to return and to address that problem. And then in 430 BC, we will encounter the final prophet that we will study, and that's Malachi. And he's basically called by God to tell them to change their ways, that they have become again slack, as their history typically shows, and he has sent a messenger to help them get back to where they need to be. If you're interested in reading other relevant scripture that helps put this in perspective for us, there are wonderful accounts of these events or events leading up to it that we find throughout the Old Testament. 2 Kings chapter 17 will give us the recounting of the captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians. If we look at 2 Kings chapter 24 through the close of that book, as well as 2 Chronicles chapter 36, we see the account of the Babylonian conquest and then captivity of the nation of Judah. The book of Daniel gives us an excellent account of the time in Babylonian captivity from the perspective of Daniel, who was one of those earliest of captives from Judah, who actually lives to see the return occur, though he does not participate in it himself. If we were to turn to the book of Ezra, Ezra does not return till much later, but chapters 1 through 6 of the book of Ezra record the early history of the return from exile. He has compiled this information when he returns himself from Babylon to Judah, and chapters 1 through 6 kind of compile that history that he has learned of what has happened. Within Ezra chapter 7 through its close, and then also the book of Nehemiah, we have that return of Ezra in Ezra and his role in invigorating spiritual commitment of the nation, and then Nehemiah's return later in his work in fortifying the city and actually acts as a city administrator for a number of years with the permission of the king. So as we wrap up this kind of overview, just to get us enough that we understand the background as we head into our study of our three prophets, we'll remind you that the remainder of this study is going to focus on those messengers that we have, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. For our lesson, we will be looking at Haggai chapter 1, and that lesson will focus on verses 1 through 8. My attempt will be to keep these particular lessons not too lengthy, 20 to 25 minutes, so that you can go through them as you have opportunity. There may be times you want to double up, or there may be times you don't have a whole lot of time. This will give you an opportunity to progress through the study at a pace that works for you. Hope you enjoy our study, and I hope you'll join us for the next one. Thank you.